There's a lot of people at the moment here down under putting their supers onto their hive. They've got their bees in, the spring is here, the bees have been doing their amazing work, the queen's been laying her eggs and the colony is booming, and it's time to put the super on top. So what we're going to do with this little hive here that we've been following the last few weeks, it was a swarm we caught, and now it's time to put the super on top. So we're going to talk through that, show you exactly how to do it, and we will hopefully the flow will continue and the bees will fill it up nicely. So first thing we're going to do is add a little smoke to the hive so the bees can start their process of settling down a little bit, so they're nice and easy for us to put the super on. Overkill again this morning with this big gas axe. Okay, now it's nice and wet at the moment, so whoops, got to put some fuel in first. That was just ashes in there. And that'll just speed up the little process here. You get a nice fire going. It's nice and wet here, so we're not worried about fire danger. We've had showers in the night, but if you are in a dry time, please be mindful there's rules and regulations about lighting your smoker. So we basically just keep that puffing. Don't pack it too full at first or it'll go out, and away you go. Of course you can light it with a normal lighter or matches as well. And here we go. As the smoker goes on, it'll get hot, so bear that in mind with your gloveless hands if you're not using your gloves. And just keep on adding. Some people like to put some green grass on top just to cool down the smoke. In the end, you want nice cool smoke coming out the front. You may as well smoke your hands if you're not wearing your gloves, just to mask your own smells to the bees. Okay. Next we're going to just come right to the entrance of the hive, and you want the smoke to go in, so don't be shy. Put the smoker right up against the entrance and just give it a couple of puffs, and that's all you need to do. Then add the leave the smoker at the entrance so the bees get that whiff of smoke as they're returning home. So while the bees are settling in, it's not a bad idea to leave it a couple of minutes now for best results with your bees. Now let's turn our attention to the super. So if you're unfamiliar with the beekeeping terminology, the bottom box here is your brood box and a box that's collecting your honey. In this case, it's the Flow Super. It's full of our flow frame invention. Goes right on top, and a box that's used for collecting honey is called a super. So here is our Flow Super, and to prepare that, what we need to do is get the flow frames ready, and I'll show you how to do that now. So these just slot in, and that's just come straight out of the box. Now in transport, the parts could have moved around, so what we're going to need to do is reset them all into the cell formed position, ready to go on the hive so the bees can actually use the cells. An important step to do. So there's one more thing before we do that, and that's to align the frames so it makes a nice window here. If you have a look at the front, you want this a nice flat window. If some frames are forward and some are back, bees could escape between them, and it's just not such a pleasant experience to have bees coming out the harvesting side. So if you come to the back of the frame, what we did here is we put little adjustment screws, so no matter the variations in wood or if you're putting them into a standard box, you can adjust that screw out, and that pushes the frame forward to form that nice flat window. So we'll do that now with the little tool we supply. It's just simply turning this out a little bit, and don't need it too tight, but just about 1 millimetre of clearance to the box is perfect. You go through, do that to each frame, and there we go. So when that's done, Check again, you've got that nice flat window. Then all we need to do is reset the frames into their cell formed position. Don't forget to do that step. So what we're going to do is just go along and pull out the caps in the top. And all we need to do is put this key in all the way to the back. Do you feel that knock as the key is at its furthest in point, and then turn it, and all your parts are now in the cell form position, ready for the bees to use. Go along, do that to each frame, making sure you're in the top slot when you do that. Okay. Keeping on going. And then what we're going to do is show you how to add this to your hive.
See, just a question while you're in there. Someone's just saying, do you need to adjust those wires that are on the flow frames?
You shouldn't need to, but if you find they're loose for some reason, we have designed it so you can tighten them up by putting another twist in the top, and we've got some videos showing you how to do that. If you've got questions, put them in the comments below. Also let us know whereabouts in the world you're tuning in from. It's really interesting to us to see that, and let us know what's going on in your honey season in your area. It does differ a lot between each region. Here we are in the springtime in Australia, and there's lots of nectar coming in. It's an exciting time of year. Other places there's preparing for the winter to come, and sometimes you're getting a nice autumn flow. Sometimes it's been dry and there's no nectar available for the bees. So that is now prepared. We can then put these covers back on. This one is the rear door, and that just pops in like that. And this is what we call the key access cover, and that sits up there. Now, next we're going to go back to the hive. We're going to take the lid off. Make sure you keep your smoker going, and now you're going to want to protect yourself from stings. So if you're new to beekeeping, wear a good bee suit or jacket. Make sure you're wearing your gloves and look after yourself. Okay, just making sure they're done up. There's the middle zip, then the side zips, and then this nice Velcro cover as a safety over the top. Undoing the wing screws on the side which hold your roof on. We can then lift off the roof and put that aside. Next, with the tool that comes with our suit and jacket kit, we're just levering that cover off. Okay. Having a quick look in case the queen is on top of the inner cover. Now, I can't see a queen there, but always lean it up against the entrance just in case you've missed her. Okay. Now next, the question is, when ready to super? Now, this hive is almost ready to super, but for the purposes of the exercise, we're going to go on and put the super on top and show you how to do it. Ideally, you'd have even more bees than this when you open it, and they've drawn each comb, which it looks like they are doing a pretty good job of now. So if we pull out one of these frames just to show you what that looks like, we can have a look at their beautiful work. So this was empty last week, and now they've drawn that much, so they're well on their way, and all the rest of the frames in the box are actually ready to are completed. So we're almost there. Ideally you'd wait till this frame was also ready. Just going to lean that up for a second. You can have a look at some of the frames in here. So while you're here, you can enjoy looking in at what the bees are doing. Look at that, that's a big comb of honey, which is typical for the edge of the hive. So I've done a great job. They've really only got one more frame to complete look at their amazing wax on these naturally drawn comb. If you've got questions, we'll get to answering those. We've been looking in on this hive, watching it grow from a swarm, and now we're going to put our super on top. Okay, any questions?
Cedar, is it a problem if the queen is producing lots of drones? Ryan's saying they've got hundreds on one frame.
Okay, so in different times of year, so in the springtime it's typical to get a lot of drones. That's their natural tendency in order to spread their genetics around. If you've got lots and lots of drones, it's possible that you don't have a queen at all. So what you need to do is look down the cells and check for eggs, larvae, presence of worker brood. So the worker brood looks like this. You can see it here. That's worker brood, and drone brood sticks out like a bullet shape. I'm not seeing any there. But sometimes you can get into a situation where you've lost your queen and the workers start laying eggs, and because the eggs are unfertilized, they can only lay drones, and you end up with a hive full of drones that don't collect nectar, don't collect pollen, don't build wax, and the colony will slowly die out unless you rectify the situation. So get in there and have a look. If you've got the presence of worker brood, then you should be okay. It's a natural cycle of them building up their drones in the springtime. Okay, beautiful.
Great. Someone's asking, Cedar, looking at that beeswax, is that original beeswax or is that human-made beeswax?
Okay, this is 100% bee-made beeswax. The reason why I know that is because we just put wooden sticks in here and let the bees do the rest from a swarm. So the bees have done their amazing job of making their wax. Now I'm just adding a little bit of smoke because I noticed a slight little aggravation from the bees as their tone changed. So I'm going to let them settle down for a moment.
Yeah, that sound, isn't it, Cedar? Why do you reckon their pitch goes higher? Is it because they're stressed, or?
So when you blow smoke into the hive, you will notice the tone change, and it's obviously a little bit aggravating, the smoke, but at the same time it's calming a little bit later. And it's something that humans worked out a very long time ago, and we still use it today in order to have a more peaceful experience of working the hive. Some hives you can work without any smoke at all and without any soot at all, while others you need lots of smoke and a lot of protection to work. So it just depends on the genetics and how the bees are behaving.
Cedar, do you ever extract honey from the brood box?
I used to extract a lot of honey from conventional frames like this, and I'm so glad I don't have to do that long process anymore. And that was the whole idea of inventing the flow frames, was, hang on, can't we just turn a handle and extract it in a completely new way? And so I don't do any of extracting from comb in a centrifuge anymore. Occasionally I will pull out honeycomb from the brood nest. So there's a beautiful honeycomb frame on the edge there we lifted up before. That would make a nice one to plate up, so you could shake the bees off and take that honey with you. It's not quite ready. In fact, there's actually a little bit of brood on that, so you'd have to be careful to make sure you're choosing a frame that doesn't have brood. You can tell the difference by just having a close look, and you get your eye in pretty quickly. That's brood there, which is a less translucent kind of capping, and it's got the silk cocoon underneath. That's why it looks a bit less translucent. And then up here you've got your honey. Of course, once the frames are older, the wax might be very dark, and that's perfectly normal as well. Look, you can see these bees taking a little drink of honey down the cells, and they're beautiful. One interesting thing is looking at the cell sizes. We've got cell sizes here that are across quite a range. These cell sizes here are about 6 millimeters, which is a similar size to the flow frames that we created. And down here you've got about 5.3 millimeters, which is a similar size to the foundation sheets you can buy. They typically will put the brood in the 5.3 millimeter size cells, or even a bit under. And when they're solely making honey, this is an edge frame, they'll tend to size it up a bit. And that's why with the flow frames, I've gone for that larger size cell.
Oh, great. And Cedar, so if you decided to take some of that honey off that frame, would you then just clean up the frame and put the same frame back into the same hive?
The wonderful thing with when you're using naturally drawn comb is you don't have a plastic sheet through here, you don't have even the wires to deal with. You can just brush the bees off, cut the comb out in the field into a tray, take that away, and you can put the frame straight back in and they'll redraw it quite quickly. So that's another advantage, whereas if you've got wax and wires, you're going to need to take that away, re-put your foundation sheet in, and then come back into the hive again. So in terms of harvesting honeycomb, it's a bit easier when you're foundationless.
Right. I've got a great question here. Leah's asking, do young foragers have to practice pollen collecting? And is there any reason why some bees have tiny pollen sacs and some have really big pollen sacs?
So it really depends on what they're collecting, and bees can carry an incredible amount of weight. So as they progress in their short life, they could take up to half their body weight in pollen or nectar. And so you'll see them with huge balls, but it also depends what's available. So if there's only a little bit available, then they'll bring it back with just small pollen bags on their legs.
It's so great watching them flying with their big baggy pollen sacs.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's wonderful to watch the entrance and you get an idea of how much pollen they're bringing in. Pollen is their protein, so it's something they do need, and you want to see some bees landing with pollen in their pollen baskets, which is basically their back legs, that ball you see on their back legs.
Cedar, just someone's asking, how long does it take for a colony to build up and fill the brood box from scratch? And I guess that's what we're doing right here now.
So this one has taken almost 2 months now since we put the swarm in. They can go a lot faster and they can go a lot slower, so it depends on mainly depends on the nectar flow, but also if you've started with a very small ball, this one was a relatively small ball of bees to start with, it'll be slower. If you've got a really big swarm like this you've started with, or you've taken a split and taken half the frames out of another hive, then it could be much quicker. I have seen a swarm fill a box like this completely in 2 days, so that gives you an idea of how fast the bees can go when they've got a big colony and plenty of nectar available to them. Okay.
Sonia's asking, Cedar, how do you know when the super is ready to harvest? Because they've got they seem to have lots of honey in their super at the moment, but it's not capped.
Okay, so typically you wait till you can see the end frame view. Let's just come down here and I'll give you an example of that. And let me see, I think this hive's probably got a good example for us in the back window here. And what I'm seeing is this frame is getting really close, but it's not actually quite full yet. You can see the honey could come out to the edge. And when you see the capping down the side, then there's a pretty good chance that it's mostly capped all the way through. Then it's good to harvest and the moisture content will be below 20%. If you happen to harvest it early, it's not the end of the world. Your honey will just be a bit more liquid. It will still be beautiful, but it may not keep on the shelf. So if you're getting impatient, you can just harvest a little bit and enjoy that. You'll consume it before it may ferment anyway. But otherwise, you may as well wait till the honey is ready. So let the cells fill up and then watch the bees put the capping on, and most of these cells full in the end window. This one's got an interesting example. It's completely full down this side. You can see the capping just in front of my finger, and that's the wax sheet. The bees put on top of the cell like a preserving jar to say, hey, we want to preserve this honey for later. And this side's got a few cells missing, which is typical for them to leave the corners of the hive not quite full. You can then go around to the side window and have a look there as well. So between the side windows and the rear window, you can get a good idea of how full the cell is. So we can see a lot of capping on the frame there. And that shows you that this frame is ready to harvest. The end window looks good, the side looks good. The likelihood is we've got a lot of capped honey in the hive, and you can go ahead and harvest some. Great question.
Yeah, fantastic. Super, cedar. Is it a problem if you put the super on too early on your brood box? Can it cause any issues?
If you're in a temperate climate with warm nights, it won't cause any issues. It'll just take a while for the bees to get up there and start working those frames. If you're in a climate that's still getting cold nights, then there could be an issue. You're better off keeping it smaller until the bees are ready to fill a larger space. Here we've jumped the gun a little bit. You can see this frame isn't quite full yet, but because we're in a subtropical region and it's quite warm, I'm going to go ahead and add the super and let the bees get started on that. But I'm not expecting them to jump up there and fill it straight away. They'll tend to finish off this last frame, which might take another week yet, and before starting to move up and waxing up all the flow frame parts. Okay, let's go ahead and complete that process. So what I'm going to do is put the frames back in, and why I'm adding a bit of smoke is that there's a bit of Bur Comb here, and I don't want to squash any bees between the frames as I close them back up. So I'm going to seize the moment while the bees aren't in there and move those frames back into their original position and put this frame back in. Be careful not to tip it over. It's delicate when it's like this. You've got a virgin wax hanging from just a wooden stick at the top. I'm dropping that frame in. Of course, you can put foundation sheets in the frames if you want. They can accommodate foundation sheets of wax or wire, and that way wax and wire or plastic foundation if you want to. It's up to you. The bees, you can get to work anything pretty much, but the preference I've found is they'll fill an empty space, a naturally drawn comb area, before they'll do wax foundation, and then the last preference is the plastic foundation sheet. You'll have to have a very strong nectar flow and a busy colony before you'll get them to fill and draw on the wax foundation, but you can get them to use the plastic foundation as well. Okay, now we may as well seize this moment while the bees aren't all around this rim to put our excluder on. So the excluder is sized in such a way that the bees can go through fine, all the worker bees, but the queen can't. And the reason why beekeepers use an excluder is you don't want the queen laying eggs in your honey collection area. So that's why we use this excluder. Some people experiment with not using them with the flow frames, and it tends to be very queen specific. One hive might lay in the flow frames and another queen won't. And I've got a hive right outside my door that hasn't had an excluder for years. If you want to experiment, you will need to check every now and then in the flow frames that they haven't changed the queen and just decided to start laying in the Flow Super. But I would recommend just putting your excluder on and making sure the queen isn't up laying cells in your Flow Super. So next we're going to just simply put this box on top. We've already prepared it and it's ready to go. If you're just tuning in now, we went through a process of resetting the frames into their cell-formed position, and then it's ready for the bees to start using. So line it up nicely, and all we need to do is put the roof back on top. So we're starting with the inner cover, making sure there's no bees on the outer rim. You can do that just by brushing them off with a bee brush or piece of foliage. or in this case, I'm just flicking some off, making sure they're not going to be in the way while I close the lid.
Cedar, while you're doing that, Joss is asking that they'd heard that maybe sometimes it's good to put a little bit of wax onto those super frames. Would you do that, or would you wait and see?
Okay, great question. Now, I generally don't do anything at all. I just wait till the colony's busy and there's a nectar flow, and the bees get right in there, wax it all up, and away they go. And if you are getting impatient, there is something you can do. So what I advise is, rather than melting beeswax and painting it on the frames and things like that, is just get your hive tool, scrape off a bit of Bur Comb. When the bees are really busy and ready for a super, they'll have built some Bur Comb on top of your brood frames. Scrape some off and push it into the flow frame surface. Do it in the window side so you can actually watch the bees recycle that wax in this window view. Now, the bees haven't come up in this case yet. There's not enough bees to really run up there, but as time goes on, they'll get up there and start waxing up all the parts. Now, it is a nice thing to watch the recycling process, and the bees will just grab that blob of wax you put there and move it around on the frame. That'll get them going a little bit quicker if you're getting impatient. Okay, then the roof goes on like that. Okay, and let's just make sure that's slotted all the way down. And there we have it. One super flow hive ready for the bees to get in there and start working those frames. After a while, they'll wax it all up and start depositing their honey. And you can watch through these windows that process happen. Make sure you leave your window covers on. You can take them off for a bit of time, but you don't want the sun beating in through that window and heating up your hive inside. You can take them off for half an hour or so, but I wouldn't leave them off altogether. So if you come over here, you can see a beautiful display of the bees both depositing their nectar and waxing up all those frame parts. In fact, these bees are getting so carried away, they're actually starting to connect some wax to the window area. That's perfectly natural. Some bees will do that and some won't. You can see down low the nectar glistening in the cells. You can see up higher the capped cells, which is windows, and look in at what the bees are doing.
Cedar, would you ever add another super onto the hive now, or would you wait?
You certainly can, and I've got hives with 2 supers. I've got hives with 2 brood boxes, and it's a fun thing to mix it up and experiment with what works for you in your area. Typically I run most of my hives like this just because it's easier with a single brood box and a single super. It's a bit easier when it comes to doing your inspections because you've just got 1 box to lift off your hive rather than 2. However, if you add another super, you'll add a lot more space for your bees, and a colony can become larger, which could be an advantage. There's different types of management practices. Some people like to run their hives smaller and then split in the springtime when the bees are really building up, and that's the way I like to do it. Others like to run their hives bigger, and that does limit the chances of swarming each year, and you don't need to necessarily go through splitting or swarm prevention aspects in order to limit your hive from swarming, which is when half of the bees take off and set up a new colony.
Cedar, David's asking, with a swarm, do you need to replace the queen?
No, you don't need to replace the queen. When they swarm, it's actually the old queen that leaves. So the old queen leaves the hive, and half of the bees will kick her out. And then that swarm ball does this amazing display, and we've got plenty of footage of that. If you tune in, we've got live swarm catches to see on our Facebook live streams or YouTube channels, and it's amazing to watch that process. So when you catch that swarm, shake them into your box. They have a queen already and they're ready to go. Some beekeepers like to requeen at some stage. And the reason why they do that is they're after specific genetics. Genetics, perhaps they're after genetics of non-swarmy activity because they don't want to have to manage the swarming each year. Or perhaps they're after hygienic traits. So you can ask for those kind of traits from a queen breeder if you do want to replace the queen in your hive.
Great. Belinda's, they've just saying that when they added their super, the bees have started to build their wax from the bottom of the frames. Wondering if that's an issue, and if it is, are there any tips on how to make them to start building from the top of the frames?
Okay, let's take this off. So it's not really an issue with the flow frames because it doesn't really matter where they start. They typically start somewhere in the centre and work out towards the extremities. On a foundationless frame, however, if you're supering with foundationless frames, then it does matter because you don't want them to start at the bottom and do this wonky comb all the way up to the top because that will be a mess. You want them to start at the top and go down. So that's if you're using just the wooden frames as you saw earlier in the brood box. Perhaps you're doing a double brood box, or perhaps you're using them for honeycomb collection in the top box, or perhaps you've got one of our hybrid hives. Now, if they start from the bottom and go up, it could be wonky. So in that case, what would be advised is you would bring some frames that are nice and straight from the bottom up to the top to give your bees guides, and then checkerboard it so you've got a straight frame, new foundationless frame and another straight frame next to it. Then the bees will tend to draw a nice straight comb in between them. So that was a long answer. With the flow frames, you don't have to worry about it. The bees will just start where they start and continue to fill the frames. It's only if you're doing naturally drawn comb in a box that's above your brood box that you have to worry about that point.
Great. Maria's from South Australia. Where are they? Just wondering, would they need to put a shade cloth up over their hive?
Well, you can. The bees will certainly appreciate it, but generally, if you have a look at around what the commercial beekeepers do, they'll have their hives just right out in the full sun, and that works fine. The bees are incredible at cooling their colonies. They'll go and collect water. One of the last jobs in the short life of a bee is collecting water, taking it back to the hive to do their evaporative cooling. They're amazing at air conditioning their space and keeping it nice and cool.
Great. Ryan's about to do a split and just wondering, is it better to buy a new queen for the queenless hive or let the bees rear a new queen from an egg?
So if you have the choice, then it could be a good idea to buy in a queen. That way you get some known genetics that are nice and gentle to keep. However, if you can't get a queen, then we will often just let the bees raise their own queen. It's also a little bit easier process to let the bees raise their own queen. Reason being is you can take half the frames out of this bottom box, stick them in another box, and as long as both colonies have eggs down the cells or somewhere, the hive that doesn't have the queen will raise a queen starting from that egg. Now, you don't need to find which box the queen is in, so that's what makes it a bit easier. If you're planning to introduce a queen, you'll have to identify which box has the queen in it. So depending on how adept you are at spotting queens will depend on which strategy you might use there.
Great. Kim from Secret Harbour in Western Australia is about to move their first nuke into their flow hive. Any tips about doing that?
Okay, a nuke into a flow hive. So when you start with a nuke, that's called a nucleus, which is basically 4 or 5 frames from the bottom of a hive put into a smaller size bee box. Often it can be just made out of core flute. Now you can go and pick them up from a bee breeder. You put them in the position you want them to be in. So that would be the first thing I would say is, first of all, put them where you want your hive to go, and you can let them settle in there for a few days. A tip, make sure they've got enough shade. If they're in a thin core flute box and it's a really hot day, they could get too hot in there. So you can use your flow hive roof to go over the top, or anything really, just to provide them with a little bit of shade while they settle into that location. Then when time allows, you could even leave them in that nuke box for weeks, depending on whether the bees are really breeding up and bolting out of that box or not. You then just move the nuke over a little bit, put your Flow Hive base down, then your Flow Hive brood box. You take out those frames out of your nuke box, wearing your protective gear, your bee suit, gloves, and with your smoker, and place those frames into the bottom here. Now, one more tip is when you add the rest of your brood frames, if you're deciding to go with naturally drawn frames with the comb guide we supply, make sure they're all squeezed up in the middle so there's not big gaps in there. Otherwise the bees will build some random comb which will be hard to fix up later. And that's basically it. Look after them and they will grow. So that's probably the easiest way to start, is to buy a nuke and put those frames into your hive. Now we've got videos showing you how to do that, and we've got very detailed, very well produced videos at thebeekeeper.org that you can have a look at also. So that's our online course. If you want to learn starting from nothing through to a deep scientific knowledge of beekeeping and a lot of practical skills, then check out the beekeeper.org. It's got lots of experts from around the world contributing to that also.
Great. See, Tricia's saying had a bit of a problem with some crystallised honey and a bit of mould in her frame, so they cleaned them out, and there's still a little bit of darkness in the flow frames. Will it be all right for the bees, do you think, or will they clean it out?
So the bees are very good at cleaning out frames to use them again. They will get down there, they will polish the cells and wax them all up, and they'll go from there. So generally it's nice to give them a helping hand. If you've left your flow frames around and they've gotten a bit manky, then if you can wash them out with some hot water and let them dry, that will give the bees a head start. Brats come to make use of the wax on those flow frames, and the bees will do the rest of the work. Make sure, as we did at the start of this video, that all the frames are in the cell form position just by putting the key in the top of the frame and turning it, and then the bees will do the rest of the work from there.
Great. We've got Chuck Rouse, our ambassador from Florida, who's just joined us.
G'day, Chuck.
And just a question, just wondering about that wax he obviously saw on that super window seeder. Does that have any effect on the operations of the flow frames?
It doesn't. So the flow frames themselves are rigid, so if they build a wax from the flow frame to the window, let's have a look at that again. It doesn't really affect the operation at all, because the flow frame moving parts are happening deeper within the comb surface. So it's inside the comb that the parts are moving. Often you'll see the capping just sitting there as it is as the honey drains out from beneath their feet. So this little bit connecting to the window will stay there. It's only when you go to take your flow frame out for some reason that this little bit of wax will need to break, and a little bit like that will simply just break off as you lift your flow frame out. So it doesn't cause an issue at all.
Cedar, can the bees swarm twice in one season? We've had a customer and she thinks her bees have swarmed twice.
They certainly can, and sometimes you get really swarmy genetics where your hives will swarm multiple times in a season. And that can be good for breeding up bees, but not so good if you're not there to catch those swarms. So if you've got genetics like that and your bees keep taking off, then it could be a good idea to get in there, change the queen to some genetics that might be less swarmy and more productive.
Great. Cedar, now you've added that super, how often should you be checking on the brood box?
That is best answered by your local beekeepers. Here in Australia, things are a bit less demanding than in the Northern Hemisphere, where you've got those varroa mites. Now, varroa mite strategies will depend on how you plan to manage those mites, and in some cases If you're in Germany, for instance, the recommendation is that you are checking weekly in certain parts of the season. Here you can leave it a long time before checking, but you must get in there and do a full brood check all the way through each comb at least a couple of times a year to look out for pests and disease.
Cedar, do the bees ever try and make honeycomb in the roof?
You can collect honeycomb in the roof, and the way I'd recommend doing that is in an organised way, where rather than just pulling this plug out, if you pull this plug out, the bees will certainly get up there and build a whole lot of comb in here. Now that can be exciting at first because it looks amazing, and you can take that whole lid to a dinner party and everybody can check out the natural formations of the bees' honeycomb and enjoy chewing on a bit of it. But it's also a bit of a mess to clean up, so I tend to just leave the cap in, and if you want to collect honeycomb in a more organised way, you can put, let's say, a glass baking dish over the top here and limit them to a smaller space and enjoy watching them build comb in that area. And that's a bit easier to clean up than all of the inside of your roof.
Cedar, one of our customers have noticed your flow jacket and they think it's full of holes.
Ah, yes.
Rather than it being mesh.
Yeah. You know, it takes a little bit to get used to these holey jackets. But this is our mesh jacket, and it's so nice on those hotter days like today where the wind can blow straight through it. So it's just so much cooler than a suit that's in the older style. So this is my preferred thing to wear, is a mesh jacket. The wind blows through. At first it's a bit unnerving because you're like, hang on, I'm not wearing a suit and I've got the hive apart. And you have to keep reminding yourself that you are. It just feels like you're not because the breeze is blowing right through the mesh. And it's spaced so that the bees can't sting through that. So there's a protective distancing layer in between, and the distance is such that the bee can't get their stinger through. And they don't tend to like this landing on this material, and so it works quite nicely, and it gives a nice level of protection from stings.
Nice. Cedar, what do you think about Marilyn from down in Victoria when it gets really hot, just leaving the tray out of the bottom of the Flow Hive too for extra ventilation?
You can certainly do that. So we've got our tray in the bottom here, and you can certainly take that tray out, and in this case we've got some oil in here. We're collecting some of these hive beetles, you can see. Now you could completely remove this tray if you want and allow maximum ventilation in those hotter times.
Cedar, do you recommend, Chuck's another question from Chuck, removing the Bur Comb Wax?
So in terms of Bur Comb, you get very little of it in the flow frames because we've sized it as such that it's unusual to get comb between the comb surfaces. If the bee spacing's right, then the bees are happy with that and they don't tend to burr it up between the flow frames, except for at the very top between our movement mechanisms. That's a bit tighter and they tend to put a bit of wax there. In the brood box, however, it depends a bit on your management strategy. Most people who are doing a lot of beekeeping tend to scrape off the Bur Comb on the top of the frames each time they're in there, just to make it a bit easier to manage, because then it's not stuck to the excluder. Now, but others believe that it's good to leave the Bur Comb there because it's like a bit of a deposit of wax, and the bees will recycle wax around the hive, so they'll get in there and use that from time to time when they need to use it. So it really depends on your strategy there. It's fine to remove it, or it's fine to leave it also.
Cedar, Taylor's asking, how does a worker bee make a queen bee?
So a worker bee doesn't make a queen bee except in some really rare circumstance, and it's every now and then a bee can clone itself. It doesn't happen often. Generally what happens if there's no queen to lay a fertilised egg is the worker bees can only lay unfertilised eggs which turn into drones, which aren't the worker bees. However, if a queen's laid an egg, and that's a fertilised egg, then the worker bees will do their part in feeding that, that young larvae royal jelly, and they'll do that for 11 days about, and she will then turn into a queen. Whereas the worker bees will get fed royal jelly for just 3 days. And that means through epigenetics, when they get those plant proteins from the pollen, they'll actually turn into a worker bee. So worker bees and queen bees start off just the same, but it's what they're fed. It will determine whether they supersize into a queen with bigger legs and bigger body, ready to go as a queen, or whether they stay as a worker bee.
Great question. Cedar, Danny's asking when they're about to extract their honey, do they need to filter it or anything, or can they just put it straight into a container?
So the wonderful thing about the Flow Hive is you can just fill up your jar and it's ready for the table. There's no more processing needed. There's no more, occasionally you'll get little flecks of wax that just float to the top of your jar, but there really isn't any filtration you need to do. Conversely, in the conventional way, you need to go through quite a lot of filtration and settling in order to get a really clear jar of honey. We're not harvesting honey today, but tune in next week and we'll show you what that looks like.
Cedar, Melissa's saying the bees are hanging around, they're looking good in the super, but they just haven't started making honey yet. How long should that process take?
It really depends on whether there's a lot of nectar available and how strong your colony is. When a strong colony coincides with the flowers dripping with nectar, then you'll get a really fast action. You can even fill a Flow Super in a week or 2. But you could equally get times where 6 months or more could go by and you don't get any full flow frames. So like any kind of agriculture, the seasons have to align, and then the rains have to come at the right time, the flowers have to flower, and then you get your honey crop. So sometimes it's a game of patience, and other times it's a good idea to have more than one colony, because some beehives collect an extraordinary amount of honey and some collect less. So there's a bit of genetics there, there's a bit of timing when the colony's big, has to coincide with the nectar flow, but generally that's how it works.
Great. Cedar Lee's asking, just wondering, I've had the super on, not sure how long. Oh no, about 6 weeks, and there's just no sign of honey. Is it okay to remove the super and have an inspection?
Absolutely. So I encourage you to get in there, learn as much as you can about beekeeping. Don't be afraid to pull the hive apart, check in, learn. You might find that in the middle of the super they actually have started waxing it up and storing their honey, but you're just not seeing it in the side windows yet. So get in there and have a look. If you're getting impatient, as said earlier, scrape some wax from the brood box and just put it in onto the flow frame surface. Don't be afraid, you won't break it. You can just mash some waxy Bur Comb right into the side of the flow frame. Do it where you can watch in the window, and then you can actually watch the bees recycle and wax up those areas.
This is a chicken and an egg question. Richard's asking, is a queen cell built up before or after the bees start to raise a queen? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg?
The answer, like most things in beekeeping, is it depends. So generally the queen cell or queen cup, it gets called when it's starting, is made first. And then once there's an egg in there, they will feed that egg, feed that young larvae royal jelly for its entire larvae duration, and then it will turn into a queen. And but one thing that can happen if you've suddenly lost your queen is they'll just find a cell that's already got an egg in it and they'll turn that into a queen cell. So that's them doing it the other way around. And in fact, there's a process called notching where you can just simply grab a tool and reshape a cell into a bigger kind of size using a tool, and then the bees just might turn that into a queen cell if that's what you're trying to achieve.
Thanks, Cedar. I think I might have lost my sound for a bit. Chuck's told me, but I think that was me. But I think I'm back on now, hopefully.
Great choice.
Cedar, how do you choose about getting stings if you've never been stung before as a beginner? Like, how do you know whether you're going to be allergic to the bees or not?
Okay, the answer is you won't. So we've got first aid links on our pages. Some people are severely allergic to bee stings, just as some people are severely allergic to nuts and things like that. So it is something. Swelling is normal from a bee sting, but anaphylaxis is not. And you certainly want to make sure you know your first aid around that. So I guess you won't know until you get stung for that first time.
Hopefully it's not too full on. Cedar, does the colour of the bees have any, does it make any difference to the sort of honey that you get? Like if you've got darker bees or yellow bees?
It doesn't make a difference to the honey. The colour of the honey is determined by the colour of the nectar. So it's a reducing of that nectar, and you'll get honeys that are almost clear through to black, through to yellows, through browns, and even slight greens. And there has been a case where bees have foraged from the goop behind an M&M factory, and then they brought in blue honey and red honey from collecting the artificial colouring, which is pretty wild. But generally, you don't get that. So it's really what they're on. However, different species of bees altogether, these are Apis mellifera, so whether they're dark or light won't make any difference. But if you go to our sugar bag bees, which is a native little bee that looks like a little black fly, now they produce completely different honey when they collect from the same flowers, because they mix the pollen and the nectar together, and that produces a pretty spicy honey, which is completely different.
Nice. Cedar, with the practice queen cups, will they put anything in these cups, like royal jelly or anything?
So the beekeepers will use artificial queen cups, which is you need a cell about 10 millimetres in diameter, and that's around there is the queen cell size, 9 or 10. And what the bees will do when there's an egg in there, and beekeepers who are breeding will go through a process of grafting where they will get tiny little tweezers and pull out eggs and put them into those queen cups, and the bees will recognise the cell size and go, that's a queen cell, and they'll feed the young larvae royal jelly, and it will turn into a queen, and you can breed lots of queens like that if you're doing it in a hive that doesn't have a queen. Not sure if that answered your question.
Sounds good. Cedar, is there any reason for bees to swarm other than space in the hive?
The main reason is congestion, not enough space. If the bees detect there's not enough space, and look in the side windows, you can get a good idea of that. If you can't see the combs because there's so many bees in there, then the likelihood is they're starting to think about raising another queen and swarming. And that's their natural division in order to create more bee colonies in the world. So generally it's space, but occasionally you do get extra swarmy genetics that take off before they've filled the hive with honey. That can be annoying. But mostly they'll wait till they're very crowded and they've got full brood box and full honey stores. So if you keep harvesting your honey and give the bees some work to do, that is one minor trigger of swarming, but the major one is in the brood box, having space for the queen to lay their eggs. So spring management, if you're wanting to control swarms, which is a good idea, you can get in there and give them some brand new space, and you can do that just by cutting out some of your wax from the outer frames and taking that home to enjoy and putting those frames back in towards the centre of your hive. And that's a typical spring management thing to do. and that gives some new space for the queen to lay and limits the swarming tendencies. We've got time for one more question.
Oh look, I like this one from Stephen saying, is it best practice to consult neighbours about keeping a hive? Some people might be worried or just complain, or do you just seek forgiveness?
Okay, well that all depends on your strategy. Great idea to check in with your neighbours, and occasionally you'll find somebody who does have anaphylaxis from bees, and you'll need to really consider that. You might be able to place the hive somewhere else on your property away from those neighbours. Most people respond very well to a jar of honey, so if you can get a jar of honey when you turn up to their door, then that is a wonderful thing, and certainly keeps your neighbours sweet. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you've got ideas on what you'd like us to cover, tune in again next week. Put those ideas in the comments below and we'll show you something interesting about beekeeping and try and answer all your questions so you can get started in this wonderful pursuit. Also check out thebeekeeper.org if you want to have a look. It's free to try, and it's a beekeeping course to take you from square one right through to a deep scientific knowledge of beekeeping.